الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
Move on to the final talk before Salat al-Asr break, and this is Professor Asma Uddin. She is a religious liberty lawyer and a scholar and a fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs. Professor Asma has previously served as counsel with Beckett, a non-profit law firm specializing in U.S. and international religious freedom and cases, and a director of strategy for the Center of Islam and Religious Freedom, a non-profit engaged in religious liberty in Muslim majority and Muslim minority contexts. She is widely published by law reviews, university presses, and national and international newspapers. She is also an expert advisor on religious liberty to the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has testified in Congress, written for the Supreme Court, and spoken in front of the UN regarding religious issues for Muslims. She will address us regarding the law and LGBT issues. What should we as Muslims know, and what should we be aware of when it comes to the law of the land? May I welcome Sister Asma Uddin to the stage, inshallah.
Is it possible to move this a little? Yeah, can you just put it to the edge? Sorry, just okay. All right. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Sheikh Yasser and Epic, for creating the space for a thoughtful, compassionate, but also probing conversation on LGBT rights and Islam in America. And thank you all for coming out today. My talk will focus narrowly on the constitutional right to religious freedom. I'm going to start by explaining what religious freedom means broadly. Then I'll explain its implications in the context of LGBT rights. I will tell you about some of the government policies that have been created or are being considered to protect LGBT individuals and how those policies are creating problems for some religious groups. Then I'll summarize some legislation that has been proposed as a solution to the religious problems so that we can start to think about a possible path forward. So what is religious freedom? Many Americans think that religious freedom is about tolerance or some fuzzy notion of diversity or pluralism. But religious freedom is actually a very precise legal concept. It means that religious individuals have the ability to live out their faith without government interference. Indeed, a vital question to the future of Muslims and Islam in America is whether each of us can live in ways that are authentic to our religious beliefs, or whether we have to practice our religion in a way that suits the government's preferences and not our own. And when I say each of us, I really do mean each of us. We love to say that we protect freedom for all, but often that's just freedom for people we agree with. But freedom for all literally means for all, and especially for people we don't agree with. As the philosopher Voltaire once said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." That legal right to say what we believe and to act on those beliefs is what religious freedom is. From all the different beliefs that people hold, American law gives religious beliefs special significance. As one of America's founding fathers, James Madison, explained, the free exercise of religion is in its nature an unalienable right, because the duty owed to one's creator is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. So what that means is that religious believers owe a duty to God, and that takes precedence over our duty to the government. There are, of course, limits to this freedom. We can't do anything that will compromise safety, security, and health. But generally speaking, the freedom is quite broad. For example, religious freedom protects our right to worship in private and also protects our religious behavior in public. And it doesn't just apply to religious individuals, it also applies to religious organizations. Our religion guides us in the way we shape our institutions, run our businesses, and interact with others. Sometimes our religion tells us what not to do and not just what to do, right? So there's some people who, on the basis of their religion, don't want to participate in a certain war. Because American law understands the essential role of religion in the lives of religious believers and the many, many ways that it impacts our behavior, it carves out a wide space for our needs to be accommodated. Religious people and organizations don't lose their right to religious freedom when they provide or receive social services, education, or healthcare, earn a living, employ others, receive government grants or contracts, or interact with federal, state, or local governments. According to a recent Supreme Court decision, the government also can't impose special disabilities on religious organizations. For example, if a state has a program that provides assistance to private schools to help build their playgrounds, the state cannot exclude private religious schools. It has to provide its benefits to everyone equally. Religious freedom also means that the government cannot do anything that interferes with our religious doctrine. It cannot decide what the qualifications should be for someone to be an imam or Islamic school teacher or religious scholar. For example, the government cannot make Catholic seminaries or Orthodox Jewish yeshivas or masjids hire female priests, rabbis, or imams. In many cases, religious freedom also protects religious believers when they don't want to follow the laws that everyone else has to follow, and those are called religious exemptions. If a religious objector objects to a particular law, either a court can let the religious believer off the hook, or the legislature can write the laws in ways that specifically say that people with a religious objection don't have to follow the law. Again, this isn't a recipe for anarchy. There's a very precise legal standard that makes sure that religious people do not abuse the law. While there are growing challenges to Muslims' religious freedom, the laws have protected us in broad ways. The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, for example, has been used to fight back against hostility when we try to build our masjids and Islamic centers. Muslim prisoners have been able to secure access to prayer rugs, halal meals, and Jamaat services in prison. A few years ago, I helped represent a Muslim prisoner at the US Supreme Court when he was told by the prison that he could not grow a beard in accordance with the Sunnah. The prison's grooming policy forbade it, but he asked for a religious exemption, which again is an exception from the rule that applies to everyone else. And he won unanimously. All 9 justices voted for him. I also filed a brief in a case involving a young Muslim woman who was not hired at a retail clothing store because she wore hijab, and she also won her case at the Supreme Court. So what does religious freedom mean in the context of LGBT rights? At the heart of religious freedom is a principle of live and let live. It is, at its core, a tool for living peacefully alongside people who hold very different beliefs than we do. This doesn't just mean traditional Muslims should be willing to live next to LGBT individuals and progressive Americans. It also means that they have to be willing to live alongside traditional Muslims. Each side has to protect its ability to exist and flourish, and we have to do that without trampling on the rights of the other side. And when I talk about rights, I am again referring to the legal concept of religious freedom, the freedom to be free from government interference in our religious doctrine. We can, as individual religious believers or masjids or Islamic centers, have conversations and debates with each other, and if we choose to, we can persuade each other about what are right or wrong positions on LGBT rights. Our scholars can grapple with this and share ideas, but religious freedom, again, means that the government cannot step into that debate and try to influence it. It cannot deny benefits or impose fines on religious institutions that follow a traditional theology on sexuality. We've seen this, for example, on issues like abortion. Many religious believers staunchly oppose abortion. Our law has navigated this area very carefully. On the one hand, it gives a legal right to abortion, and on the other hand, it gives an exemption to, for example, religious healthcare workers who don't want to actually perform the abortion. The question that we are facing today in America is whether we can strike a similar sort of win-win solution when it comes to traditional religious believers who object to homosexual conduct. I wholeheartedly believe that to figure out a win-win solution, we have to try to understand both sides of the problem. And that requires that we approach the problem as a problem about human freedom, not as a problem that has to do with conservatives versus progressives. The culture is pitting these two sides against each other. We see it day after day, where we are told that only one side of the debate is good and moral, and the other side is bigoted and evil. One thing I will mention throughout my talk today is how, at least in my world of law and human rights, there's nothing inherently conservative or progressive about the issues. Yes, it's definitely portrayed as political, but the fact is that religious freedom is neither a conservative nor liberal political idea. And there are really strong voices who reject the politics and stand with integrity. Some of our country's top legal scholars who are progressive and support gay rights also see very clearly the problems that religious people are facing, and they are working hard to resolve those problems. Some of the advocates fighting for religion are themselves gay individuals. Similarly, many religious conservatives understand the real problems that LGBT people are facing and want to find ways to protect them while also protecting religious institutions. We as Muslims should be among the people who rise above the politics and all the fighting and add reason to the debate. We should demonstrate the ability to speak across divides with respect and civility and be the type of people who engage with others not on the basis of their politics, but on the basis of their ideas and their intentions. So while today's talk is mostly about the difficulties that traditional religious believers are facing, I do want to start by acknowledging the suffering of LGBT people and some of the legitimate reasons the government is aggressive in its protections for them. Many LGBT people in this country are facing real hardships. They have been subject to violence and harassment. Gay kids have been disowned by their parents and kicked out of their homes. In fact, LGBT youth represent 40% of the homeless youth population, and of that population, as many as 60% are likely to commit suicide. People have been denied healthcare or evicted from their homes simply because they are gay. As religious believers who are compassionate and merciful toward the truly downtrodden, we understand that these people need protection. And indeed, federal and state governments recognize the problem and are enacting measures to prevent some of this suffering. For example, 22 states and the District of Columbia have what are called SOGI laws, laws that ban discrimination on the basis of either or both sexual orientation or gender identity. So I want you to remember this term. Okay, remember SOGI, S-O-G-I, stands for sexual orientation and gender identity, because I'm going to be using the term throughout my talk. And in other states, activists are working hard to enact these laws. So the other state has a law, or in other places, people are working really hard to get these protections. And the government is also adding protections in the laws that regulate many areas of human activity. As you know, the government in the US is everywhere. Federal, state, and local governments issue permits and licenses that determine when and where people can live and work. They make decisions about what schools must teach and which schools can be accredited. They own vast amounts of property and resources. They hired tens of millions of people. They issue billions of dollars in contracts, grants, and loans. And they collect trillions of dollars in taxes. What that means in practice is that the government gets to regulate a wide range of behavior based on the criteria that it sets. Some states that provide vouchers for parents to use to pay for private schools say that schools can't get these vouchers if they prohibit homosexual conduct. Social service providers like hospitals, homeless shelters, substance abuse programs, and adoption agencies can also be denied grants and contracts if the state thinks that they're discriminating against LGBT people. For example, the federal government issued a regulation that will cut off billions in funding to hospitals if they decline to perform a sex change operation. The American Psychological Association, which has authority from the government to accredit psychology programs, has considered adopting a policy that would deny accreditation to colleges and universities that have religious codes of conduct. The American Counseling Association has adopted ethics rules requiring counselors to advise couples on their same-sex relationships. The same ethics rules have been adopted in several states, and so on. So, as you might have guessed, growing protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, again, that is SOGI, S-O-G-I, have created problems for religious believers who hold traditional beliefs about marriage and sexuality. These are not beliefs that religious believers, such as conservative Muslims, can just change. They are rooted in something enduring, even absolute. So when the government says that Muslims have to change their beliefs and practices under threat of penalty, Muslims feel that their whole worldview is at risk. And the Supreme Court has acknowledged this religious vulnerability. Even as it ruled in 2015 that same-sex couples have a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, it also said that religious believers need, quote, proper protection for the right to live the religious principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths. and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure that they have long revered. Unfortunately, even though the Supreme Court understands this fact, other government entities do not. And that's where the problems start. To understand the scope of the problem, first consider how big our government is. As I noted earlier, the government is everywhere. It gives out a lot of money and therefore has a lot of influence. Now consider that the government gets to decide which groups get that money, and that increasingly it refuses to give funding or benefits to religious entities that object to homosexual conduct, and in some cases, it also imposes hefty fines. So while religious believers still have basic rights, for example, imams can refuse to officiate same-sex marriage, and masjids, Islamic schools, and Islamic centers can refuse to hire people who are in same-sex relationships, there are a wide array of legal conflicts that are happening now or that will be emerging soon. So there are two types of conflicts. One involves private lawsuits, and the other one involves government penalties. Private lawsuits are when one person sues another because they think they violated some law. One area we see this in is public accommodations, which are businesses that provide goods or services to the public, like hotels, restaurants, and theaters. Various laws make it illegal for these businesses to discriminate on certain grounds, like race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. The most famous is Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was enacted during the civil rights movement to fight discrimination against African Americans. Over time, the definition of public accommodations has grown very broad, so that we're not just covering hotels, restaurants, and theaters, but also any entity other than a house of worship that is open to the public. The prohibited grounds of discrimination have also expanded to cover age, disability, marital status, and in some places, sexual orientation and gender identity. The addition of SOGI to these public accommodations laws have created problems for conservative religious believers. For example, you're probably familiar with the case of the US Supreme Court from a couple of years ago that involved a Christian baker who refused to make a custom wedding cake for a gay couple. The gay couple sued the baker for discrimination. There have been several other cases like that that involve Christian wedding vendors, photographers, videographers, and florists. The Christians in this case say that they cannot make custom goods for gay weddings because that to them is the same thing as celebrating a same-sex wedding, which they cannot do because same-sex marriage is against their religion. They will make any other cake or take any other picture for the gay couple, but they won't participate in the wedding festivities. Now, I don't know that many Muslims can relate to the Christian baker. Muslim bakers and florists might not see their products in the same way. In fact, I think most Muslim business owners wouldn't even contemplate turning away a customer for reasons related to sexual orientation. But it might still be helpful to think through the scenario. For example, maybe a Muslim party planner or event decorator who is asked to decorate a hall for a same-sex wedding might feel that doing so violates his or her religious beliefs about marriage and sexuality. Or let's take it outside the wedding context. There was a case involving a print shop. It was called Hands On Original, and it prints t-shirts. The company is owned by Blaine Adamson, who has a policy of not printing messages that contradict his religious beliefs. But one day, the Gay and Lesbian Services Organization, or GLSO, came to the shop and asked Blaine to create t-shirts that promoted the 2012 Pride Festival. Blaine said no, but he also tried helping them find another printer who would do it for the same price. GLSO ended up getting the t-shirts for free from another printer, but it still filed a complaint with the local Human Rights Commission, which ordered Blaine to print the shirts and attend diversity training to change his views. When Blaine challenged the ruling in court, he won his case, but it's important to realize that this sort of scenario also subjects religious business owners to legal risk. This is especially the case because the Supreme Court has not decided whether it's lawful for religious business owners to refuse to make products that celebrate gay rights. So even though that case in 2015 that had dealt with a Christian baker, the court actually ended up not deciding the issue. Legal scholars are still debating the issue, and as I noted earlier, both progressive and conservative legal scholars are really struggling through the question and trying to figure out how to best protect religious interests. In fact, in the t-shirt printing case, some gay business owners came to the defense of the t-shirt printing company. They said that forcing anyone to do things that are against his or her beliefs is absolutely wrong. They recognize that it is against both individual freedom and the freedom of speech to make anyone say or promote things that they do not believe. So outside the area of public accommodations, we also see problems in the employment context. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is a federal law that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. It generally applies to employers with 15 or more employees, including federal, state, and local governments. Title VII also applies to private and public colleges and universities, employment agencies, and labor organizations. That part of the statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex is the subject of a case pending at the Supreme Court right now. The question in that case is whether that prohibition should extend to SOGI, or again, sexual orientation and gender identity. If the court decides that it should so extend, we can expect many, many conflicts to arise. Religious employers exercise their religion in part by forming workplaces composed of employees who are of the same faith and who live by that faith. Basically, for an Islamic center or association to be truly Islamic, it has to have the legal right to make employment decisions based on whether the employees are behaving according to the shared religious values. If you think specifically about Islamic schools and Islamic institutes, you know that we see religious education as critical to the existence and perpetuation of our community. They are vital means by which we transmit our beliefs and practices to the next generation. But if the court decides to change Title VII by adding SOGI protections, it will disrupt the ability of traditional Islamic schools to teach and model the Islamic tenets that they were created to uphold. In particular, it will trigger disputes over the rights of religious schools to restrict hiring to those who share the institution's faith and live by its religious standards. If the government, under threat of penalty, can force a traditional or conservative Muslim school to hire a teacher whose behavior rejects those beliefs, it will directly undermine the school's Islamic mission and the reasons that the Muslim community even supports those institutions. Thorny problems will also arise because Islamic orthodoxy draws theological distinctions between desires and orientation on the one hand and actions on the other. So an Islamic center might be fine with hiring a man who has same-sex attractions as long as he doesn't act on those attractions. But let's say after he's hired, he decides to engage in homosexual conduct. Would it be legal for the Islamic center to fire him if Title VII is read to include protections for sexual orientation? Now, to be clear, the religious organization do have some protections, which I'm going to go over briefly. One is the religious exemption to Title VII, and two is the ministerial exception, and there's also some protections under a statute called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But as you'll see, these protections are not completely adequate. So first, the religious exemption. Title VII has a section that says religious organizations can hire individuals of a particular religion, and it defines religion to include all aspects of religious observance and practice, as well as belief. But there are various loopholes and weak spots in this exemption that still leave plenty of room for religious employers to be sued. And importantly, that exception was not developed with SOGI protections in mind, so if we add SOGI protections but don't also carefully expand the religious protections, we can expect a lot of lawsuits. Years of litigation will be necessary to distinguish between lawful religious standards under the exemption and religious standards that plaintiffs will say are nothing more than unlawful SOGI discrimination. Some of the advocates who are in favor of adding SOGI to Title VII are saying, don't worry about it, there's no threat to religious freedom, look, there's like this religious exemption there. But when the time comes, there's going to be plenty of lawsuits where attorneys will argue that the religious exemption needs to be interpreted as narrowly as possible. So consider a couple of scenarios. Can a Masjid or Islamic center hire only employees who live the traditional Islamic sexual ethic? Or is that just a form of unlawful sexual orientation discrimination? Does the answer depend on whether the ethic is consistently enforced as to both heterosexual and homosexual misconduct? So for example, if a masjid knows that one of its heterosexual employees is engaging in sexual misconduct and doesn't fire him, but then finds out that an LGBT employee is engaged in homosexual conduct and does fire him, the court can say, you weren't equal in the way that you treated these employees who violate your religious beliefs, and so therefore you lose. And even just getting the information for this will require attorneys in the court to delve deep into the masjid's history and hiring and firing practices to see whether the masjid was consistent in its treatment of employees. Or maybe a court will say that the religious exemption simply allows masjids to limit their hiring to Muslims, but doesn't allow them to set a behavioral standard that will adversely affect LGBT Muslim employees. These are the sorts of lawsuits we can expect if the Supreme Court decides to add SOGI to Title VII. So the other protection is a ministerial exception, which shields religious employers from discrimination claims that interfere with a religious organization's ability to hire people considered quote unquote ministers, or people who are important to the religious mission of the organization, like religious leaders or teachers. For example, the US government cannot force a Catholic church to hire homosexual or female priests, or dictate to an Islamic school who is and is not allowed to be or qualified to be a teacher there. This exception offers critical protection for religious employers, but its coverage is not broad enough to fully protect religious organizations. It is largely limited to whether the employee is considered a minister, and there are cases pending again at the US Supreme Court right now that are about how we should define that term. Religious freedom advocates are working to make sure that the definition of minister is broad. For example, we'd like to see that term include any person who serves in positions of leadership, performs important functions in worship services and religious ceremonies and rituals, and people who are entrusted with teaching Islam to the next generation. But the fact is that there are many employees who are important to religious organizations that the Supreme Court might say are not ministers. And it's even more uncertain with the lower courts, or the courts that are below the Supreme Court. If SOGI is added to Title VII, this will be another area of frequent disputes. For instance, an Islamic organization's budget director may not strike the court as ministerial enough, even if the organization thinks that people who manage Masjid and zakat donations are critical to its religious mission. Finally, there's also a statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that gives special protection to religious individuals and organizations, but this statute has so far been interpreted narrowly when it comes to these SOGI claims, and there's also a growing movement by the LGBT rights activists to stop the statute from applying in civil rights cases. So those are some examples of private lawsuits. Now consider some government penalties. Religious schools, including Islamic schools, receive a variety of government-sponsored vouchers, tax credits, grants, and loans. Any of those could be revoked on the grounds that religious schools are guilty of discrimination against LGBT people. Discrimination would include things like having a policy that says employees and students cannot engage in homosexual conduct. Muslim social service providers can also be denied grants and contracts if they have a policy like this. And then you have college and university accreditation. Consider the case of Gordon College, an evangelical school that holds to Christian orthodoxy on sexuality and asks its students to refrain from sex until marriage. It also defines marriage as a union of a man and a woman. In 2014, when President Obama issued an executive order banning sexual orientation discrimination by federal contractors, Gordon College sent a letter to Obama asking him if he could include an exception for religious contractors. When news got out about this request, the school's accreditor, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, decided that it would revoke the school's accreditation if it did not change its policies about homosexual conduct. So if you want to think about this in Muslims' terms, consider Zaytuna College in California. My understanding was that when it was seeking accreditation, it feared being denied for those same reasons. Its honor code, for example, says that students are required to be modest and, quote, maintain appropriate boundaries. Another controversy is whether a religious adoption agency must be required to let gay couples adopt the children in their care. Adoption agencies have to have a license in order to work, but now some states are denying those agencies a license if they refuse to let gay couples adopt. In some places, Catholic adoption agencies that have been working for more than 100 years are forced to shut down because of this policy. So again, if you want to think about this in Muslim terms, I know of at least one Muslim adoption agency in this country who is trying to find loving homes for refugee children, and my understanding is that they also do not adopt gay couples and are therefore at risk for this. Now I know we're getting close to Usr time, so I have to kind of cut this short, but hopefully we'll continue it during the panel. So as you can see, the problems are definitely real, and the culture can be unforgiving to conservative perspectives. And we should be able to peacefully coexist in a society with people who hold very different views than our own. We need to be able to live and let live. Unfortunately, there are some very prominent voices who argue that in the battle between religion and LGBT rights must always win. In October, Beto O'Rourke, who was still running for president at that time, said in a CNN town hall that he would support stripping tax-exempt status from religious organizations if they objected to homosexual conduct. Similarly, Louise Smelling, who's the deputy director of litigation at the ACLU, has also said that anytime there's a conflict between these two groups, that the LGBT individual should always win. And New York Times columnist Frank Bruni wrote in 2015 that church leaders must be made to take homosexuality off the sin list. Not must be persuaded, but must be made. In other words, forced not to just to change their behavior, but forced to change what they believe. A Muslim scholar recently wrote that if Muslims who believe that same-sex relations are haram also support LGBT rights, they will suffer from cognitive dissonance. And I actually have a series of examples here why that cognitive dissonance is absolutely not necessary. There are actually win-win solutions. It's going to take me a little while to get through them, so instead of rushing through that, maybe we can save that for the panel discussion. But I just want to end with a sort of general note, and hopefully that's a cliffhanger for later, that there is a way to get past this conflict. There are solutions, and inshallah, I look forward to speaking about that. Thank you.
إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما.